Good afternoon, everyone. This is part 4 of the presentation that Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ. Today, we're going to be going over the Daniel 7 kingdoms. And for these kingdoms, Baha'u'llah wrote letters to each of the leaders of the world, and that's what we'll be breaking down today. So let's begin. For today's presentation, we're going to be going over 3 world leaders. We're going to be going over Napoleon III. That's he was the leader of France. Then Kaiser Wilhelm, he was the leader of Germany. And then Queen Victoria, she was the leader of Great Britain. Baha'u'llah wrote letters to each of the world leaders. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you a little overview of the biblical symbolism. Then we'll break down the exactly what was going on in each country. Then we'll tie it off with exactly what Baha'u'llah said to each of the world leaders. So we're going to go over the first 3 beasts in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. Remember, biblical prophecy is written symbolically, not literally. Because if you remember from last week, I broke down the leaders of Islam, and that showed you exactly how it lined up with biblical prophecy. And so I'm going to do the same thing for each of the first 3 beasts. It says in Daniel chapter 7, 4 great beasts, each different from the other, came up from out of the sea. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on each of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back, it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads and was given authority to rule. So we're going to go through each beast individually, and each part is going to be breaking down a beast. But I want to recap a little bit from last week, because last week we went over the 4 beasts, because in Daniel 7, there's 4, not 3. This was the one that was the Islamic Caliphate, and then the Islamic Civil War that took place with Muawiyah ahead of it. So I'm just going to read this off, and this is just a recap from last week. It says, after that, in my vision, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the other beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one which came up among them, and 3 of the other first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like a human and a mouth that spoke boastfully. If you remember, those are the leaders of the Umayyad Caliphate from last week. But that's the recap from last week. So Daniel tells us exactly what these 4 beasts are. He says, the 4 beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. So as I said, we're looking for 4 kings here. One was Muawiyah from Islam last week. But before we get there, I want to point out one thing, the phrase, the Ancient of Days. This phrase shows up 3 times in Daniel chapter 7. And this is the only time in the Bible and only place that this phrase shows up. And it says, as I looked, the thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and his wheels were ablaze. So this is someone sitting in a throne giving judgment on these beasts. It says a few verses later, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with my clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Again, we're looking for a person here. Later on, it says, as I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. Again, so the Ancient of Days is someone who's going to sit in the throne and pass judgment on these kingdoms. And here is Baha'u'llah's letter to Napoleon III. He says, wert thou to incline thy inner ear unto all created things, thou wouldst hear. The Ancient of Days has come in his great glory. Everything celebrateth the praise of its Lord. Some have known God and remember him. Others remember him, yet know him not. Thus, we have set down our decree in a perspicuous tablet. Notice he uses the phrase right here, the Ancient of Days. That's how we know that we are dealing with one of the kingdoms right here when Baha'u'llah writes this letter to Napoleon III. And what Baha'u'llah is saying here is, I am the Ancient of Days, and here is a judgment that I'm going to be passing on to you. And so what we're going to do, we're going to get to French history, then we'll break his letter down. And Daniel 7, I want to make sure we're focusing on the first beast here. It says, the first was like a lion and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being and the mind of a human was given to it. So for part of the symbolism, because the letter was written to Napoleon III. His uncle, Napoleon I, used the French imperial eagle. That's why you have the wings of an eagle in here. This is symbolism for France. And before we get to Napoleon III, we're going to watch a brief YouTube video. It's going to be showing just kind of how vast the French Empire became under Napoleon I, and just all the war for that happened. Because when we get to his nephew Napoleon III, that's going to play a significant history in French in the decision making of the day. So we're going to watch the YouTube video here. All you really need to get out of this YouTube video is just how vast the French Empire became and just how much warfare took place under Napoleon I. So here we go.
Is there supposed to be sound?
Yep, there is.
Steven, I don't hear any sound from our end.
It's a very quiet sound, but
It's just music.
yeah, it's just music. It's a very quiet sound, but I just want everyone to see how vast the French Empire became under Napoleon I.
Okay.
All right. The reason I showed that, I was wanting to show everyone exactly how vast the French Empire became under Napoleon I, because it ruled from Spain all the way to the Russian border. And there were seven coalitions that were put together to finally defeat Napoleon I. And so when we get from Napoleon III here, he's going to be trying to model himself off of Napoleon I, which is going to play significant roles in the events of the day during the 1800s, and when Baha'u'llah wrote his letters to the world leaders. And so that's what I wanted to show you during that. But let's get over to Napoleon III. Napoleon III, he was a nephew of Napoleon I through his first wife, Josephine. So they did not have a blood relation with each other because his uncle and Josephine did not have any children together. And he was the heir of the French Empire until Emperor Napoleon remarried Marie of Austria and had a child named Napoleon II. Long story short, Napoleon II and others in line before the third passed away, which left Napoleon III heir to the French Empire. However, as you saw from the video, Napoleon I was defeated, and when he was defeated, the French monarchy, the Bourbon monarchy, was reestablished. And what the French monarchy did is began going after anybody, like killing and imprisoning anyone who supported Napoleon I. And this is known as the Second White Terror, because the color of the French monarchy was white. And so because of this, Napoleon III, he was forced to live in exile, and he exiled to modern-day Germany, and he eventually resided in Switzerland. So he did not grow up in France, he grew up in exile. Now, Napoleon III as a person, there's a couple things that he loved in his life. The two things he loved were power and women. At every point in this presentation, I just want you to assume he has mistresses and he's having affairs. That way I don't have to get repeating myself, because he really heavily went through them all. And the other thing he loved was power, because what he wanted to do is he wanted to continue the glory of Napoleon I. He wanted to reestablish the Second French Empire, because as I showed you in that video, the French Empire spanned from Spain all the way to Russia, and they were the dominant power in Europe. So he wanted to continue that glory and the power of his uncle. And also he was a romantic revolutionary, and he believed that was his destiny to rule France. Because during this time, he was living in Italy. Italy was not yet a unified country. It was a bunch of warring countries. So he was also a passionate supporter of the Italian cause of freedom and Italian unity. And while he's in Rome one day, he received a reputation for being very much of a loose cannon, because what he decided to do is he's going to get on a horse, ride down the middle of the streets of Rome, which Italy did not control at that time, waving an Italian flag. Well, that did not go over very well with the Pope, who controlled Rome at the time. So he ended up getting into a skirmish with the Papal Guard, and it caused a riot. And what ended up happening is he was eventually forced to leave Italy, because the Pope wanted him exiled for basically trying to incite a riot in a rebellion against the Pope. So he eventually was exiled from the area. And after that is when he received his reputation for being very much of a loose cannon. Now, as I said, the French monarchy, they were reestablished in France, and the first French Empire under Napoleon I was deposed of. The French king who deposed Napoleon I passed away in the year 1824. And the heir, Charles X, he was very much of a repressive religious bigot. He must set up a government of the clergy, by the clergy, and for the clergy. And so what he did is he really alienated a lot of people in France during this time. And plus, the other thing about the French Revolution, what happened is the French church was heavily tied into the French monarchy. So when the French revolutions happened, it really created a backlash against the church. So a lot of people in France did not like the church because of this. And so when Charles X was creating a government of the clergy, it created a huge backlash. And only 6 years into his reign, he was forced to step down due to a massive rebellion against him. And then that's when a new king was crowned. And now Napoleon III, remember, he's still living in exile at this point, and he wants to rule France. So he's looking for an opportunity to start a rebellion and crown himself Emperor of France. And he sees that the French monarchy is having problems. They're not very popular. So he wants to create a coup and set himself up as Emperor of France. Well, if you remember back from the video, Napoleon I, his uncle, was deposed of twice. The first time, he came back to France and he overthrew the French monarchy without a shot being fired. It was completely bloodless. His nephew, Napoleon III, he decides that he wants to do the same thing, and he wants to set himself up in a coup, a bloodless coup like his uncle, and make himself Emperor of France like his uncle. So he starts looking for opportunities to make this happen. In 1836 is when he began to make his move. So Napoleon III, he moved over to Strasbourg, and what he was going to do was he's going to cross into from Germany, modern day Germany, into France. He's going to send out the edicts saying, I am the emperor, you need to rally behind me. And there's still a lot of soldiers in the in the French military who served under his uncle. And he thought the military and the people were going to rally behind him when he carried the French imperial eagle. That's the plan. Well, it wasn't a very well thought out plan because he didn't get much support. The only person who supported him of any significance was a colonel. And the only reason that colonel supported him is because his mistress wouldn't sleep with him unless he supported Napoleon III. And Napoleon, sorry, what? Oh, yeah, no. So they, other than that, nobody would support Napoleon III in his attempt. So when Napoleon III crossed into France, he went to the general's office. He declared himself Emperor of France. The general was legitimately confused about what was going on because there was no forward planning, no forward declarations for this. So they were very confused. Then the general refused to support him, so he had the general arrested. So he went over to the soldiers' barracks. He walked in the soldiers' barracks, declared himself to be Emperor of France, and the soldiers were also very confused about what was going on because they did not know who this guy was. Long story short, they all refused to support him, and Napoleon III ended up being arrested. His bloodless coup that was supposed to set himself up as Emperor of France only lasted for 2 hours, and he was arrested and then exiled to America. And when he was exiled to America, they decided that they're going to take the long way to America. So they went down the coast of Africa, over to South America, up the coast of South America, and into America. So now Napoleon III is living in exile in America. So he's not even in Europe anymore. And after a few years living in America, he got word that his mother was dying in 1838, and she was living in Switzerland. So what he decided to do was, without getting permission from the president of America, he decided that he's just going to get on a ship, sail to London to get a passport to get to Switzerland to see his dying mother. Well, he made it to Switzerland. We made it to London, then he got his passport, and then he got to Switzerland, and he was able to see his mother before she passed away. Well, the French monarchy did not like Napoleon's heir being there. So the French monarchy was very discontent with the presence with Napoleon III's presence in Switzerland. So it started to turn to a really big international incident, what was going on. Because French monarchy wanted him out because they feared of what he may do. So what Napoleon III decided he was going to do, but he decided he's going to create a huge international incident, get the good publicity from the European courts, get all the gossip going. Then he's going to leave right before an international incident takes place to make himself look like a national hero, which it worked. He came out looking really good, even though he was the one who started it, and even though it was all a lie on his part. So what he did is he returned to London, and this is where he began to make his next plans to take over France. Now, here's the next attempt to seize power. What he was doing, when he was living in England, he's in London, he was gathering money, gathering allies in the European courts. He was talking with the French military because he wants to stage another coup to make himself Emperor of France. And so the date was set for 1840, and the coup would be in the French city of Boulogne. The reason he picked this is because the body of his uncle was returning to France. So he wanted to be coming off the ship the same day that his uncle's body was coming off, because then he could say, I am the return of Napoleon, and there's a lot of strong symbolism behind that. And that's what he wanted to do to ride and make himself Emperor of France, which actually was a pretty good plan, but it was very poorly executed, as we're about to see. Because what happened was the ship left England late, and so when Napoleon III arrived in the coast of France, the soldiers he's supposed to be meeting there who supported him weren't there. So he ended up running into somebody who did not support him. And so what he did is had those guys captured. Those loyal to Napoleon III were saying, you need to have these guys executed. They're going to tell on you. And Napoleon III is like, no, I want to do a bloodless coup here. Just make them promise that we're not going to tell on me and let them go. Well, of course, those guys, they said, we're not going to tell on you. First thing they did, ran out and told on him. And so now the French monarchy and those who oppose him all know he's there, so his bloodless coup isn't working out very well. So when the soldiers arrive, Napoleon III decides that he's going to give the decree, I am the emperor, follow my orders. And a lot of the soldiers said, no, we're not loyal to you. We're loyal to the French monarchy. So what Napoleon III decided to do is he decided to pull his gun out and shoot one of the soldiers. Well, if you want them to side with you, you don't shoot one of their buddies. That's just common sense right there. So the regiment turned on him and he was arrested. And this coup attempt that was supposed to be his second one, to make himself Emperor of France, it was over in 24 hours. And after this, he ended up spending 6 years in prison because the French monarchy did not want him in exile. They wanted him in prison at this point. So, long story short, he spent 6 years in prison and he escapes to London in the year 1846. His last two coup attempts to make himself Emperor of France were just total failures in every level. And so he decides that he's just going to wait for events to happen. He's going to gather money, resources, and allies, and just wait for events, which he caught a lucky break. 1848 was the year of the revolutions in Europe because there was a lot of social upheaval going on. It was also the same year that the Bab was put on trial. And so the French monarchy was overthrown in the year 1848, and the French middle class took over, forming the Second French Republic. So what Napoleon III did is he sailed from London to Paris to assume power, because now that the French monarchy is gone, he doesn't have to worry about living in exile anymore. So it's going to be working out in his favor. So, but remember, Napoleon III does not want to be elected. He wants to be emperor for life. That's his goal. So when he gets in there, he goes through the election cycles and he's elected the head of 4 departments, but left Paris soon due to anti-Republican statements. So as I said, he does not want to be elected to a department. He wants to be emperor of France. That's his ambition, which this worked out very well because what happened is the French middle class rebelled against the French middle class, and there was a massive rebellion which had to be put down. But since he wasn't there anymore, he came out looking really good in it because he had nothing to do with that. And so he returned and he was elected president of France. As I said, he's not satisfied being president of France. He wants to be emperor of France. So it's time as president. He chose the title of Prince President because since he was the lawful heir to the French Empire, Napoleon, his uncle, he wanted the title of prince, but he also wanted the title of president to go along with it to get the legitimacy of the Second French Republic. And one thing he was noted for was spending a lot of money to satisfy his whims. He kept going over to the French legislature saying, I need more money, I need more money. And the French legislature is like, no, we're not giving you more money. You just need to learn to live within your means like all the other leaders of Europe do. Another thing he wanted to do is he wanted to have his, to vote to have his power expanded, but that was also rejected. Because now a lot of French wanted a democracy. They did not want an emperor for life. So that was also rejected. So he had a choice. Do I just live within my means and accept that I'm the president of France, which had term limits? Or do I stage a coup and overthrow the French Republic and set myself up as emperor of France? Those were his decisions that he had to make. And so what happened was he's planning to stage the coup in December 1851. There were a few reasons for this. This was the anniversary of his uncle becoming emperor of France. Plus, this is also the anniversary of his uncle's greatest military victory at the Battle of Austerlitz. So there was a lot of symbolism behind this time. Plus, the French presidency had term limits on it, and he didn't want a term limit. So he was coming up to the end of it. So he kind of had to move at that point. So what he did is he only told a few people very close to him about his plans to stage a military coup to set himself up as emperor of France. That only a few people knew because he didn't want his enemies figuring out what he was planning. And so December 1851 came around, and the night of the coup, that's when he sent the orders out to everyone who was loyal to him and supported his bid as emperor. So they went out, the military went out, and those loyal to him went out, and they staged a coup, and he successfully set himself up as emperor of France. But a lot of people did not support what he just did because he just destroyed the French Republic and destroyed democracy, setting himself up as emperor. So what he did is he pulled his soldiers out of Paris because he wanted to draw all of his opposition out. When all of his opposition came out, then he sent them right back into Paris. And there was a huge fight in Paris. And over 400 people were killed, and he arrested over 27,000. And after this happened, Napoleon III's response was, not my fault. Again, he couldn't accept responsibility for what he just did. And a lot of people widely condemned him as a traitor who betrayed the French Republic. Now, this was the end of the Second French Republic, and this is the start of the First French Empire. And the people also voted in favor of it. They overwhelmingly voted in favor of it, but everyone who voted against it and everyone who opposed him was thrown in prison or executed. So take that election for what it was. So now he is emperor of France, and he wants to set himself up as an empire. So what he wants to do is he wants to go start a war someplace. That way he can expand the French Empire. And then that gets you a lot of the glory of the empire. And he's also following the footsteps of his uncle. Because remember, his uncle controlled Europe from Spain all the way to Russia. So he decided what he's going to do is he's going to start a war over, he's going to declare himself the protector of the Catholic Church. And he's going to start a war with the Orthodox Church, who's with Russia. Here's what the Crimean War is fought over. You got a set of keys here? Who holds a set of keys? Is it the Orthodox or is it the Catholics? That's literally what this war is fought over. He just wanted to start a war for no reason. That way he can expand the empire and get the glory that goes along with it. This war was 100% unnecessary. And in this war, there were 750,000 people killed over who holds a set of keys. And during this war, his nephew also could not fight and returned to France. So Napoleon III decided that what he was going to do was he was going to lead the French military. But he decided at the last minute that he was going to not lead the French military. And he decided to go to Great Britain instead because it was more fun to party over there. So he didn't actually lead it. But the peace talks were held in Paris. So the Crimean War is widely recognized as a victory for France, and the peace talks were held in Paris. So it was a huge boost to French prestige and Napoleon III's ego. But again, this war was completely unnecessary. So my next step is emperor. While he was emperor, he's also almost assassinated by Italians who wanted a French Republican uprising. Because I said, Italy was not a unified country. So they thought that if they assassinate the emperor of France, that's going to start a French Republican uprising, and then which is going to spill over and start an Italian Republican uprising. So the assassination attempt failed. But what he decided to do was he's going to go start a war in Italy against Austria. That way he could protect himself and he can start covering up Italy. I mean, the whole point of the war was just to protect himself. There was no other point to the war than that. So what he did is he fought two battles against the Austrians, the Battle of Magneto and Solferino. Both of them were victories for Napoleon III. But rather than actually finish the war, he just on a whim decided that he didn't want to fight anymore. So he decided that he was going to sign a really bad deal for France and just go home early. So things have potential going bad, but still, this is still widely considered to be the height of Napoleon III's power, which is the year 1860. Remember, Baha'u'llah declares to be the return of Christ in the year 1863 at the Garden of Ridvan. So we're coming up to the time of Baha'u'llah here, and we'll get into his letters soon. But another thing Napoleon III decided that he wanted to do was he also decided that he wanted a monarchist ally in America. So he decided to go start a war in Mexico. Because the Archduke Maximilian in Mexico, Napoleon III wanted him king of Mexico. So what it is, he pushed for a war in Mexico before Maximilian even made this decision, which the war initially was won by the French and the Maximilian and the monarchists in Mexico. However, Napoleon III changed his mind. He didn't want to be there anymore. So he pulled his forces out, and then King Maximilian was overthrown. He was actually executed for a war he didn't even want. But this is what Napoleon III was doing during this time. So this is where we come to Baha'u'llah's letter to Napoleon III. Here's what he said. O King of Paris, tell the priests to ring the bells no longer. By God, the true one, the most mighty bell hath appeared in the form of who is the most great name, and the fingers of the will and of the Lord, of thy Lord most exalted, the most high. Toll out the heaven of immortality in his name, the all glorious. Thus had the mighty verses of thy Lord been sent again down unto thee, that thou mayst arise to remember God, the creator of the earth and heaven. In these days, when all the tribes of the earth had mourned, and the foundations of cities have trembled, the dust of irreligion hath enwrapped all men, except such as God, the all-knowing, the all-wise, was pleased to share. So what Baha'u'llah was saying right here is, look, I am the return of Christ. The priests don't need to ring the bells any longer. I'm the return of Christ, and we need to start following me. And when he says down here, and the foundations of the cities have trembled, and the dust of irreligion hath enwrapped all men, except such as God, the all-knowing, the all-wise, was pleased to spare. When the French Revolution happened, there was a really big backlash against the French church because they heavily supported the monarchy. So when the revolution happened, that's when a very strong secularism and strong anti-religion really got going into France. So when he's talking about the dust of irreligion, he's referring to all the lack of religion that was beginning to take hold in France. And this really got going in the early 1800s, and it just kept getting going more progressively that direction. So this is the first part to his letter. Second part. O king, we heard the words thou didst utter in answer to the Tsar of Russia concerning the decision made regarding the Crimean War. Thy Lord verily knoweth, is informed of all. Thou didst say, I lay asleep on my couch when the cry of the oppressed who were drowned in the Black Sea wakened to me. This is what we heard thee say, and verily thy Lord is witness unto what I say. We testify that which wakened thee was not the cry, but the promptings of thine own passions. For we tested thee and found thee wanting. Remember, as I said, the Crimean War, Napoleon III said that he's doing this to protect the Catholic Church. But the whole war was fought over who holds a set of keys. That's it. And so this is Baha'u'llah here saying to Napoleon III, I know why you started that war with Russia. You did not do it to protect those who are persecuted. You did not do it for the church. You started this war for your own ego and for your own pride. And in this war, 750,000 people died for no reason. And you will answer for this. So, as I said, thou did say, I lay asleep on my couch when the cry of the oppressed were down, who were drowned in the Black Sea wakened me. He didn't actually care about the oppressed. He just did this whole thing for his own ego, and which is what Baha'u'llah is telling him right there. And he goes on to say, arise and make amends for that which escaped thee. Ere long the world and all that thou possessest shall perish, and the kingdom shall remain unto God, thy Lord and the Lord of thy fathers of old. It behooveth thee to conduct thine affairs to the dictates of thine desires. For what thou hast done, thy kingdom will be thrown into confusion, and thy empire shall pass from thy hands, as punishment for what thou hast wrought. He's saying, you started all these wars for no reason, just to feed your own ego. Now you need to start making amends for what you did, and you need to begin turning to the path of God. If you do not turn to the path of God, your kingdom and the French Empire is going to collapse, and it's going to be all taken from you. Because what he's doing is he's running his whole kingdom off of basically his whims, just to satisfy every whim. Because here's just a few lists of what we went over today. His failed attempts to gain power. Those first two coup attempts, there's very little planning done in them. As I said, he would just cycle through women. He would just use and discard them. The money he was spending, he was just kept wanting more and more and more. He was never satisfied. Any books that were critical of him, he had made sure they were censored. All these wars that were based on whims of his, that he just wanted for his own pride. And his response was, not my fault. And even those people who were closest to Napoleon III said that this guy was a born schemer. So, part 4 of the Baha'u'llah's letter to Napoleon III, he says, this is referring to after his kingdom is overthrown. And Baha'u'llah says, then thou wilt know that thou hast plainly erred. Commotion shall seize all the people in that land, unless thou arises to help the cause and follows him who is the Spirit of God, Jesus Christ. In this straight path, hath thy pomp made thee proud, but my life, but it shall not endure. Nay, it shall soon come to pass, unless thou hold fast by this firm cord. Paul's here saying, if you turn to my teachings, you will keep your empire. But if you continue to go away from my teachings, you are going to lose your empire. And after you lose your empire, that's when you know that you have messed up. But you aren't going to know it beforehand. It's going to be after you've lost everything. And so, this is where we come to the Austro-Prussian War. Because Bismarck, he was a Prince Chancellor of Germany, because Germany is unifying as a country. We're going to get more to him in part 2. He met with Napoleon III and agreed to give Venice to Italy in exchange for France's neutrality in this next war to come. There was no benefit to France in this deal other than to satisfy the whim of Napoleon III, which Baha'u'llah explicitly told him not to do. Stop ruling by whims. So Prussia went to war with Austria, and Prussia defeated Austria, which shocked many people. And again, he's continuing to do everything on whims, because Napoleon's advisor says, we need to go defeat Prussia right now before they get too powerful and defeat you. Napoleon didn't feel like it, so he decided not to go with Prussia when he had the opportunity. Now this comes to the Franco-Prussian War. This is a war between Germany and France. So you had Bismarck, the Prince Chancellor of Germany, versus Napoleon III, head of France. What Bismarck basically did is he sent a letter to France with kind of a dual meaning to it. It was insulting to Napoleon III, but it really wasn't. He knew how he was going to take that letter. So Napoleon III, again, ruling off a whim for everything, his pride was damaged at this point. So he decided that he's going to take France and go to war with Prussia or Germany interchangeably. And so he went to go to war for the honor of France's nation. France had a very outdated, disorganized military at this time. However, Napoleon III thought that I'm going to lead the French military because we had the strongest military in Europe. And he's decided what he's going to do is he's going to go conquer Germany. And the French are chanting to Berlin. They're excited about this war. We're going to defeat Germany. France mobilized 2 million soldiers and Prussia mobilized 1.5 million soldiers for this war. And Napoleon III decided that he's going to lead the 2 million soldiers into Germany. And I'm going to show you day by day the Franco-Prussian War. It wasn't a very long war, but you'll see how it turned out. All right, so as you can see, France lost that war really badly. Napoleon III, he was captured at the Battle of Sedan against Germany. And after he's captured, his wife said, why couldn't he have just killed himself? And then Napoleon III, to the last day, his dying breath, he regretted that. And he's his last words were at the battle of Sedan, what cowards we were out there. But I don't know what this we thing is he's talking about because the French military stood and fought for him. He was the coward. There was no we in there. So, but as Baha'u'llah said, if you continue the path you're going down, you will lose your empire and you will regret it to the dying day, which is exactly what happened. And so in the aftermath of this, the Second French Empire collapsed, the Third French Republic rose, Germany formed as a country, the Papal States, which was where the Pope was, they were dependent on French soldiers. They were annexed into Italy. The Kingdom of Italy was formed, and Russia and Austria continued to decline. So there were serious repercussions for all of Europe in the aftermath of this. Now, bringing us back to the Bible verses, it says, the first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. Because the wings, as I said, were the Napoleonic eagle. That was a symbol of France during that time. They grew from the lion because Napoleon III planned his coups and his attempts to take over France from England, when their symbol is the lion. So that's why the wings of the eagle grow from the lion. And then he was successful in becoming the emperor, which is why it was stood up. But the mind of a human was given to it because it wasn't something of God. It was just whatever he wanted it to be to satisfy his whims. That's why the mind of a human was given to it. And with that, we are going to be taking a 10-minute break, and we're going to be jumping over to Germany next. So the people who overthrew Napoleon III, they're going to be the ones we're going to be going over next. Baha'u'llah's letter to them. So with that, we'll take a 10-minute break, come back at 2:55, and I'll be here to answer any questions. Yeah, you can. All right. All right, welcome to part 2. For part 2, we're going to be going over the second beast, which is Germany. So, all right, we're going to be focusing on the just the second beast here, what Daniel 7 says regarding that, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll go over German history, then we'll go into Baha'u'llah's letter. It says, and there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. And Baha'u'llah says, O King of Berlin, give ear unto the voice calling from this manifest temple. Verily, there is none other God but me, the everlasting, the peerless, the ancient of days. Here is where he uses that phrase, ancient of days, again. That's how we know that we are that we're dealing with one of the 3 kingdoms in Daniel chapter 7. Because I said, the ancient of days is the only time in the Bible that phrase shows up. And since Baha'u'llah uses it right here, that's how we know we're dealing with one of the kingdoms. And as far as the symbolism, the 3 ribs in his mouth, between his teeth, Germany had 3 Reichs to it. First was the Holy Roman Empire, then the Second Reich, which we're going to get into, then the Third Reich, which was what Nazi Germany was. It says, get up and eat your fill of flesh. Those were the series of wars that Germany fought, and we're going to get into it. And as far as what the bear symbolizes, this was the coat of arms for the city of Berlin. It was the bear. That's why Paul says, O King of Berlin, referring to the bear right there. He's referring to the 3 Reichs that are going to be coming. And we'll jump to German history a little bit. The first German Reich. This was the Holy Roman Empire, and it was founded by Emperor Charlemagne in year 800 AD. His name is very much of an oxymoron because it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. But that it was still called the Holy Roman Empire. Here's where it was at the height of its power, and unified basically Central Europe all the way down to Rome, and they had vassals over modern-day France and all the way out to modern-day Russia. So it was a very large kingdom that they had. And Pope Leo III, in the year 800 AD, he was the one who crowned the Holy Roman Empire. And this Holy Roman Empire, it stood for 1,006 years before Napoleon I, if you remember him from part 1 of our presentation, he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1806. But by the time he dissolved it, it had literally no power. And it was there in name only. Nothing was there to support it. So when he dissolved it, the guy, after it was dissolved, the person in the carriage said that there was a greater significance to the 2 people arguing outside his carriage than there was to the Holy Roman Empire being dissolved. So by 1806, there was really nothing behind it. But then, as you saw, Europe went to the Napoleonic Wars, and then Napoleon was deposed of. And then in the aftermath of Napoleon being deposed, this is what Germany looked like afterwards. It was just a confederation of countries with Prussia. Prussia was the dominant German kingdom during the 1800s. So, and then you have like the Kingdom of Hanover, the Kingdom of Bavaria. It was just a collection of a confederation of kingdoms. And then you had like France, Austria, and Russia. They were the ones surrounding it. But one thing I want to point out, Prussia and Russia are 2 different countries. Prussia eventually formed into Germany, and that's what we're going to be going over right now. Russia is a completely different country. So even though they sound very similar, they're very different. And so in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, this is what Germany looked like. It was not a cohesive country. And if you remember from part 1, this is when the 1848 revolutions began to sweep Europe. In France, the monarchy was overthrown. In Germany, there was very large-scale discontent with the German autocratic states. Because as I said, it wasn't a cohesive nation. It was just a group of states or countries. So what happened is with the German liberals, they wanted to begin uniting Germany under one country. So they clashed with the Prussian military in the streets. Well, long story short, the German liberal revolution ended up failing, and their German monarchy, the Prussian monarchy, they remained in place. And the autocrats in the ruling class, they were still in power. And the German Confederation ended up being dissolved. However, they did accept the liberal constitution. So it was no longer an absolute monarchy. It was a constitutional monarchy. So the revolution didn't bring up about the liberalism it wanted, but they still adopted the liberal constitution. So it was not a total failure. Otto von Bismarck. If you remember from part 1, he's the guy who handed Napoleon III that really bad deal and defeated Napoleon III. But before we get to the Franco-Prussian War, Here's what he said on Prussian unification and German unification. He said, the position of Prussia in Germany will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. Prussia must concentrate its strength and hold it for the favorable moment, which has already come and gone several times. Since the treaties of Vienna, our frontiers have been ill-designed for a healthy body politic. Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by blood and iron, or German Eisen und Blut. What he meant behind blood and iron here, he meant that that's Prussian military power, because in Prussia, the country was run by the military. And he said, the mistake we made in 1848, 1849 was we tried to get democracy in there and we tried to do discussion and majority decisions. Total failure. That's not how we're going to unite Germany. We are going to unite Germany behind Prussian military power. So now, anyone who knows anything about Prussia knows one thing that they're known for, their military. Here's a few quotes from the Prussian leaders on the military. Karl von Clausewitz, he was a Prussian military theorist. He said, war is an extension of politics. Because to them, like, oh, let's go fight a war. No big deal. All it is just an extension of politics. What the French Enlightenment writer Voltaire said, where some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. Because in most countries, you have the state that's the head of it, and the military is subordinate to the state. Well, in Prussia, the state was subordinate to the Prussian military, and it's the Prussian military that ran everything. And then here's what Frederick the Great, one of the leaders of Prussia, he said, diplomacy without military might is like music without instruments. He also said, God is always on the side of the strongest battalions. So in Prussian society, the military was just a way of life. It was considered perfectly normal. And even Napoleon I, he widely goes down in history as the greatest leader ever. Before he went to war with Prussia, even he was very hesitant to go to war with them because he knew how strong the military was. And as you saw from the video part 1, he overcame the Prussian military. But before he went to war with Prussia, he really had to do his homework, and he did not want to do it initially because he was afraid of the Prussian military and what they could do. And so when Otto von Bismarck here says, we are going to unite Germany behind Prussian militarism, this is what he was referring to right here. They're going to use the Prussian military through a series of wars to unite Germany into the Second Reich. And so the first war of unification under Germany was the Second Schleswig War. This war was fought between Germany and Denmark because the Danish king passed away without an heir acceptable to the German Confederation. In other words, they just wanted to start reclaiming some of the territory under Prussia and begin reforming the German Confederation. So Prussia and Austria went to war with Denmark. And during this war, Denmark surrendered Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg to Prussia. So we're going to do here, we're going to watch a video. This is Eat Your Fill of Flesh Part 1. Because remember, the bear had the flesh in his mouth and he said, go eat your fill of flesh. And these are going to be the series of wars of German unification. So this is going to be the Second Schleswig War, day by day. All right, so This is the first Schleswig War. This is the smallest war that was fought in the German War's unification. But next, this is when we get to the Austro-Prussian War, because they started uniting. This is Germany began to unite under a country under the Prussian military. So German nationalism was on the rise. And if the Prussians ever wanted to unite Germany, they had to get rid of the Austrian influence over the German states that were there. And so this is when Bismarck went to Napoleon III from part one and agreed to keep France's neutrality in exchange for the peace, which France agreed, and that turned out to be a huge mistake for France. But many people thought that Austria was going to be the ones who were going to win this war. However, this actually shocked everybody when Prussia won the war, and this was known as the 7 Weeks' War. And in the after this victory, this is when the North German Confederation was formed. So here we're going to be watching this is Eat Your Fill of Flesh Part 2. We're going to be watching the Austro-Prussian War. This is going to be a little bit shorter of a video. All right. So as you can see, Germany is not yet a unified country. They're slowly uniting themselves under the Prussian military. And so this is where we get to the Franco-Prussian War. And this is what the war that was fought between Napoleon III and Bismarck and the North German Confederation. Because as you saw in that previous video, South Germany was not united under the German at this point. They were still their independent countries. And as I said last time, Bismarck damaged Napoleon III's pride, setting off the Luxembourg crisis, which set off the Franco-Prussian War. Because France wanted to remain the dominant power in Europe, so France declared war on Europe. And as we showed you from last part, that was a decisive Prussian victory in Napoleon III was deposed of. I already showed you that video, so I'm not going to show that one again to save a little bit of time. So I'll get everyone out here a decent time. So at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, this was the formation of the Second Reich of Germany, because this is when they controlled all their land from East Prussia down to Württemberg. So Germany was now a unified country under the might of the Prussian military. And Germany, they weren't satisfied with just staying in Europe. They began to send out colonies to Africa and to Asia. Because when most people think of colonialism, they only think of like France, Great Britain, the Dutch, the Belgium. No, Germany also had their colonies. And they began colonizing parts of Africa and Asia. And under the Prussian military, they had the strongest army in Europe. They had the strongest economy in Europe. And to protect their colonies, they wanted to build the biggest navy in Europe too, which was threatening the British Navy. So by this point, Germany is the dominant power in Europe. And with all the changes that were happening after Napoleon, it's really upsetting the balance of power in Europe. And people are starting to take notice of it. And so this is where we get to Baha'u'llah's letter. What did Baha'u'llah say to Germany during this time? His letter to the Kaiser, the King of Germany. He said, "Do thou remember the one whose power transcended thy power, Napoleon III, and whose station excelled thy station? Where is he? Whither are gone the things he possessed? Take warning and be not of them that are fast asleep. He it was who cast the tablets of God behind him, when we made known unto him what the host of tyranny caused us to suffer. Wherefore, disgrace assailed him from all sides, and he went down to dust in a great loss." Remember, he says this to Germany for a reason. Do you remember where Napoleon III was? Because it was Germany that overthrew Napoleon III. So Baha'u'llah is here sitting there saying to Germany, you remember what happened to Napoleon III here? You need to learn by what happened to him. You need to turn to the teachings. Because where's Napoleon III now? Everything he possessed, his empire, his pride, everything is gone. And Napoleon III died in exile, regretting exactly what happened to him. If they do not start learning from what happened to Napoleon III, then the same thing is going to happen to them. And they need to turn to the tablets of God. Because Napoleon III, he went down in disgrace. And he's telling the Germans here, if you're not careful, you're going to go down in disgrace along with Napoleon III. Baha'u'llah goes on to say, think deeply, O king, concerning him and concerning them, who like unto thee have conquered cities and ruled over men. The all-merciful brought them down from their palaces to their graves. Be warned, be of them who reflect, O banks of the Rhine. We have seen you covered in gore, inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against you, you shall have another turn, and we hear the lamentations of Berlin, though she be today in conspicuous glory. So when Baha'u'llah says here, referring have the conquered cities and ruled over men, those were the independent countries that consisted of Germany before the German wars and unification started under the Prussian military. Because Germany, the Prussia, they brought Napoleon III down, and they also brought all these other cities down that once ruled over men. And Baha'u'llah is saying, learn from their mistakes, because if you're not careful, you are going to have a lot of wars taking place. And it says, oh, banks of the Rhine. That's referring to Germany there. We have seen you covered in gore. That was referring to the Franco-Prussian War right there. The war that Germany fought with France that united Germany in deposing Napoleon III. Inasmuch as the swords of retribution were drawn against you, you shall have another turn. That's referring to World War I right there, because this is the prophecy that was given by Baha'u'llah. And he goes on to say, and we hear the lamentations of Berlin. That's referring to World War II, which is when the Soviet forces entered Berlin in 1945. Though she be today in conspicuous glory. Because as I said, Germany was the dominant power in Europe at the time. Yes, your nation is great. Yes, you are the most powerful army in Europe, but this is going to be short-lived. If you don't turn to the teachings, your nation will go down just like France did with Napoleon III. This was Baha'u'llah's warning to Germany. And as in Revelation 16, it says, look, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed. Then they gathered the kings together in a place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, it is done. So this is the battle of Armageddon coming up here. And Baha'u'llah says, remember, Abdul-Baha says, remember, Abdul-Baha, he's the Paul equivalent in Christianity. He says in 1912, we are on the eve of the battle of Armageddon, referred to in the 16th chapter of Revelation. The time is 2 years hence, when only a small spark will set aflame the whole of Europe. Social unrest in all countries, the growing religious skepticism, antidote to the millennium, and already here will set aflame the whole of Europe as the prophecies in the book of Daniel and Revelation. By 1917, kingdoms will fall and cataclysms will rock the earth. Because he said that in 1912. 1914, the Archduke of Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, and that's what started World War I, exactly as Abdul-Baha said it was going to happen. The 1917 was when the monarchies began to fall, starting with the Russian. And we're going to watch the day by day of World War I here. This is Eat Your Fill of Flesh, Part 4.
Seit der Reichsgründung ist es wohl 43 Jahre meiner Vorfahren heißes zu sehen gewesen. Der Welt Frieden erhalten und in Frieden unsere kraftvolle Entwicklung.
that it is hard for Americans to realize the magnitude of the war in which we are involved.
Рабочей крестьянской революции, о необходимости которой в то время говорили большевики, совершила.
Abdul-Baha said in 1917 that the governments began to fall. Russia just went down.
Mezzi iniziò il 24 maggio 1915 e con fede incrollabile e tenace valore condusse ininterrotta ed asprissima per 41 mesi e vinta.
All right, so that was part one to the Battle of Armageddon. In World War I, 20 million people died in that war. So then what happened in Germany after World War I, because we saw that the Germans lost the war. This is when they attempted to set up a democracy in Germany, which is known as the Weimar Republic. Now, I'm going to be giving you the German perspective here. I'm not saying I agree with the German perspective, but this is what their arguments were. Because the Germans believe that the Allies started the war. Even though Germany took the first shot in World War I, they say that what started the war was when their ally, the Archduke of Austria, was assassinated. And then you saw how much land the Germans still had. They always said, why did we surrender in World War I? Which is what led to the stab in the back theory in World War I, because they started saying, we lost the war because we were betrayed on the home front. That's why we lost. Then you also had the Treaty of Versailles coming in, which was an insult to Germany, because France was very angry about the Franco-Prussian War, and they're very angry about World War I. So France wanted to stick it to Germany as much as possible. So the Treaty of Versailles came in, which said that Germany must accept all responsibility for the war, and they must pay the Allied countries reparations for the war, which Germany didn't want to do that. So with how World War I came to an end, it really set the stage for World War II to come. Then afterwards, the communists in Germany, they attempted to set up a communist government and had tried to have a revolution a year after their government fell. But what happened there is former army units formed militias not under government control. So the central government in Germany didn't even have control of their military and these militias, because Germany was not supposed to have a military after World War I, but they got ignored, and these army units just formed their individual units. Then hyperinflation hit Germany. So basically one German dollar in 1918 was worth 1 trillion German dollars by 5 years later. So the German economy was wiped out. So what happened in Germany? So what the French decided to do, because Germany still owed them those reparations, the French sent their military into Germany and started taking the German industrial equipment because their money is worthless. So this is just compounding Germany's problems. Again, you had the largest political party in Germany, which is the Social Democrats, attempting a communist revolution to set up a communist government in Germany. And this is when an angry Bohemian corporal went home after the war, full of anger and hate. And this is where you start to see Adolf Hitler coming to power. Because while all this was going on, Hitler was forming the Nazi Party, and they were winning a Nazi revolution on the right. So what's going on in Germany was a massive depression. The communists trying to set up a government on the left, the Nazis trying to set up a government on the right, the French coming in and taking the German industrial equipment, and the German Republicans, they were powerless to do anything about it. Germany was just literally tearing itself to pieces as a country. And I want to give you an idea of just the hyperinflation that hit Germany. Because as I said, in 1918, one gold mark was equivalent to $1. Then here's the inflation. So one gold mark is now 1 trillion. So whenever somebody went to the store to go buy food, they literally had to bring a wheelbarrow full of money with them. Because there's stories, there's a story of this old lady, she went up to the store seeing if she could afford any bread, and she had a bucket full of money. While she's looking at the how much the bread costs, some kids run up to her, dump the money, and take the bucket, because the bucket was literally more valuable than the money was. And it said right here, just to afford a loaf of bread, you have to bring a wheelbarrow full of money in. The German economy collapsed. And this is where we begin to see the formation of the Third Reich, which is the third rib in the book of Daniel. Because Hitler, he formed the Third Reich. And by 1936, the Nazi Party was the only legal party in Germany. And this is what Nazism was based off of, was social Darwinism, eugenics, and German nationalism. Because what the idea was, because like how scientists, they'll put like species between birds into form species. They started putting humans into species. So like the Aryans, the French, the British, they were considered the superior races. And like the Jews, the Poles, the Gypsies, they were all considered inferior races. So under Nazi laws, where you stood Nazi law was dependent on what you were born into. So as I said, if you're like born German, you were considered superior. If you're born like Jewish or Polish, you were considered inferior. And then what Hitler started doing is he started rearming the German military in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Because I said, Germany had a very strong military tradition to it. And so he started bringing that military tradition back. And Hitler wanted to avenge Germany against France for the Treaty of Versailles. Plus, he also wanted to start expanding Germany east for colonization, because he's saying we lost that territory, time to take it back. So Hitler started annexing the surrounding countries, redrawing the map of Europe. And then in 1938, that's when the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, that's when he went to Germany, signed a peace treaty with Hitler, and he went back to Great Britain and said, peace in our time. And as we know, that did not happen. So this is Eat Your Fill of Flesh, part 5. And this is going to be day by day of World War II. And then we'll be ending with part 2.
Meine Herren Abgeordneten, ich habe Sie erst heute Morgen um 3 Uhr einberufen können. Dank der Organisation, Flugzeuge, Bereitstellung und Kraftwagen ist es gelungen, einen großen Teil der Abgeordneten rechtzeitig heranzubringen.
terra, mare e barca. La missione della rivoluzione e delle missioni. Uomini e donne d'Italia, del mistero e del regno della nostra.
захватчики, слух немецких оккупантов. Да здравствует наша славная Родина!
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Wochen der Kampf um die rote Wolga-Metropole. Luftwaffe zerhämmert in pausenlosen Einsätzen die Widerstandsmächte. Zahllose Batterien der Artillerie mürben den zähen Verteidigungswillen des Feindes.
Der seit langer Zeit auf uns folgenden Erwartung, sehe ich nunmehr den Augenblick gekommen, um wieder zum deutschen Volk sprechen zu können.
The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeat in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground.
Товарищи, соотечественники и соотечественницы, наступил Великий День Победы над Германией. Фашистская Германия, поставленная на колени Красной Армией и войсками наших союзников, признала себя побежденной и объявила безоговорочную капитуляцию.
Okay. So, as Baha'u'llah said, if you're not careful, you're going to meet the same fate as Napoleon III. And as we saw, Germany was defeated twice. First in World War I, then World War II. And after World War I, 20 million people were killed in that war. World War II, 72 million people were killed in that war. And that's why the World War I and World War II is the Battle of Armageddon that Revelation 16 describes. So in the aftermath, this is when the Cold War started. Germany was split into East and West and then reunited in 1991. And just to review the Bible verse, and there before me was the second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. So the bear is a symbol of Berlin. It was the 3 ribs are the 3 German Reichs. And it would get up, eat your fill of flesh. Those are the wars, that series of wars that we just went over, that Germany fought. And with that, the time is 3:31. Let's come back at 3:40 and we'll do part 3. And I'm going to run a little bit over in time, but if you have to go, that's fine. So I'll be here for any questions. All right, we're getting ready to part 3 here. This is going to be the third beast, and this is going to be a letter to Queen Victoria and Great Britain. Now, the third beast. After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its in my back had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads and was given authority to rule. Now, like the 4 heads and the 4 wings, this is the United Kingdom, because you have England, Scotland, Wales, and then at the time, Ireland was all one country under the United Kingdom. So the 4 pieces here are describing the 4 aspects of the United Kingdom. And the leopard was because the symbol of London, as the French always referred to the symbol of London as a leopard. That's where that comes in at. So, and then Baha'u'llah here, the proclamation Baha'u'llah, he says in the letter to Queen Victoria, lay aside thy desire and set thine heart towards thy Lord, the Ancient of Days. This is where we see the phrase Ancient of Days coming up. And as a reminder, the phrase Ancient of Days is only used in Daniel chapter 7, referring to these beasts. And it was Baha'u'llah, or the Ancient of Days, who cast judgment on these countries. And so we're going to be getting into Great Britain here. And we're going to follow the same format. We're going to get into British history. Then we're going to break the letter down. So Queen Victoria, she was born 24 May 1819. She had a very, very rough relationship with her mother. Her mother was kind of a very controlling person who liked to degrade her a lot. So they did not get along very well. But despite this, Queen Victoria, she still became queen only a month after turning 18. So imagine being 18 years old and being queen of a country. This is what she had, the mountain that she had to overcome. And even though she was a very, very young queen at the time, she was still very popular at the beginning of her reign. So her reign began 20 June, 1837. Now, 3 years before Queen Victoria became queen, the United Kingdom ended slavery. So this is one thing she was coming into. However, as I said, she was very popular at the beginning of her reign, but due to court scandals and then her dealings with the prime minister, she became much less popular soon afterwards. Because there was a bunch of just court gossip that she did not handle very well, that really made her look really bad. And then dealing with Prime Minister Melbourne, he was in the opposition party, because Queen Victoria, she supported the Whig Party, which was more the people up top. Melbourne, he more supported like the party that were like of the people. So they didn't get along. So she got a reputation as being very elitist and very partisan as a monarch, which is a reputation that was a not good one to have at the time. And also another thing, she really tended to heavily micromanage her cabinet at the beginning of her reign, because it's typically a symptom of someone who's a very insecure leader. They'll micromanage everything. That's usually a symptom of insecurity. And considering she was only 18 when she became queen of the United Kingdom, that's very understandable for someone in her position. Now, part of being queen is you have to get married and you have to have children to continue the royal family. King Albert came in. He was from one of the German states. He was from the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Now, initially, Queen Victoria did not want to marry Albert because, as I said, she had a very rough relationship with her mother. So she had a really negative view of marriage at the time. And then she also didn't want to start sharing her power because she wanted to be queen. She didn't want to have to fight over who's going to be in charge with Albert. However, they ended up marrying each other. And then the struggle ensued over who was going to be in charge. Because Queen Victoria, she had absolutely no desire to lay aside the duties and the responsibilities she had at the time. And King Albert had absolutely no intention of being sidelined. So early on, it was very much of a struggle over who was going to be king, who was going to be queen. Now, they got to a point where they could work together very well. Initially, Albert won because of Queen Victoria and King Albert, they had about 9 children together. And when you have 9 children, it's hard to be a mother for 9 children and be a queen. So in the short term, King Albert was the one who went out over kind of who was in charge. In the long term, it was Queen Victoria because she had longevity over King Albert. But once they had everything sorted out, who was doing what and got on the same page, they made a very good team together. Because I personally call it the trio. Because King Albert, he focused more on plans like lift people out of poverty, improving the housing for working class. Queen Victoria, she focused more like on individual compassion, like women's rights, rights for minorities, animal rights. She was really good at picking up stuff like that. And then our prime minister, he was really heavily worked with the opposing political parties. That way he kept the United Kingdom really going as a cohesive nation. So when all 3 of them got on the same page with each other, they were very, very popular. And usually when foreigners came to England or United Kingdom, they were in awe of the people's love for Queen Victoria, because once they all got on the same page, things were going really well and people loved them. So, and this brings us to remember the 1848 revolution, because remember part 1, the 1848 revolution overthrew the French monarchy. The 1848 revolution forced Germany into a constitutional monarchy. Now we're getting into how the 1848 revolution began to sweep into the United Kingdom. Because again, this is when liberalism was beginning to sweep into Europe. And of course, you have a monarchy there. A lot of liberals are not going to like that. And as Victoria is kind of watching all the monarchies beginning to fall, she started to become very afraid that they were going to be overthrown too. And when they became Queen Victoria, she was always appalled by violence. She hated violence. So she was very afraid that they were about to be violently overthrown, like the French monarchy was. But what King Albert did is, rather than send out the military, he wanted to begin addressing the grievances of the people without using excessive force. Because he figured if we start using excessive force, that just means people are going to fight back even more. But if we start addressing their grievances and the needs of the people, then they're not going to support the revolution. And it worked. England, they still had fighting. There were still protests going on, but nothing near on the scale of what happened in other countries. So what King Albert did is, not using excessive force and soothing the needs of the people, it worked. And the British monarchy survived because of this. Now, it is also worth noting, in 1848, this was the year of the Irish began to suffer the potato famine. And that's when millions of Irish were either forced to leave Ireland or starved to death. But that's going to come up later, but it is worth noting this slide that is the year that began to happen in. And so, in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, as I said, the British monarchy survived. So what King Albert wanted to do is he wanted to get some way to begin moving the country forward, a way to demonstrate the British power that we're coming into a new golden age. So what he decided to do is he was going to create the Great Exhibition. And the exhibition was so large, it would take 20 full working days to see every exhibit in here. And he broke it down into 4 sections. First one being raw materials, second was the machinery, third is manufacturing, and the fourth is the sculpture and fine arts. Because during this time, the British Empire, they were going through the industrialization. And so he wanted to begin demonstrating to the world, we are an industrialized country. We are modernized. We are going into a new golden era. And over 5.5 months, over 6 million people came to visit the Great Exhibition. So it was very much of a success. And this Great Exhibition remained in place until 1936, when it was destroyed by a fire. But it was up for over 80 years. So it was actually very, very successful. And then the Crimean War, if you remember, this is the war that Napoleon III started a war over who holds the set of keys. Do the Orthodox hold the set of keys, or do the Catholics hold the set of keys? So this is where we get to the Crimean War, because Russia fought the British, French, and Ottomans. So Queen Victoria and King Albert, they sided with Napoleon III in going after Russia during this war. Now, because the reason the British really wanted to stop the Russian expansionism was the Ottoman Empire, the last Islamic empire, they were really beginning to collapse. And Russia was taking more and more territory. Britain did not want that because it's threatening their interests in the Mediterranean Sea. So Great Britain sided with the French. So the British generals sent their troops into battle with absolutely no forward planning. Within 2.5 years, 23,000 British died. and only about 4,000 British died due to combat from the Russians. The rest died due to like disease, malnutrition, just total lack of planning. Now, even though this was actually kind of a disaster for the British, Queen Victoria still came out looking really good because she was doing everything she could to like advancing the British medicine. Because so many people died, she wanted to improve British medicine. Taking care of the widows for those who had fallen, taking care of the the women who had their husbands fighting, making sure that those who came back were very well rewarded with like medals, publicity. So even though this did not turn out very well for the British, Queen Victoria still came out looking really good because she did everything she could to take care of the soldiers and take care of the people back at home and to advance British medicine again. So that's basically Great Britain's role in the Crimean War. And so then the reign between King Albert and Queen Victoria continues. They began addressing people's needs like clean water, clean air, sanitation for the people. So remember, this is when Great Britain was going through industrializing. They had a lot of people packed into the cities, and Queen Victoria and King Albert really wanted to address the needs of the people. And then Queen Victoria, she hated violence and hated war, but she also knew that sometimes war was necessary because like the mutiny in India, which is controlled by the British, she used the British military to deal with that mutiny. So she also wanted to maintain the British Empire at the same time. She didn't want to see it collapse. They also knew this time, because remember Napoleon III, he did everything off of a whim, and he's very much of a loose cannon. Queen Victoria and King Albert, they became very concerned about the ambitions of Napoleon III, and they just increasingly considered him unreliable. And so they really did not have as many dealings as you would think with Napoleon III. As I said, they viewed him as unreliable. He was a loose cannon. And during this point, King Albert and Queen Victoria, they were just at the height of their power. The British Empire is on the rise. Things are going well. They're starting to have much. They are having children. They're becoming grandparents. And Queen Victoria just absolutely idolized King Albert. It's almost to the point it's kind of an unhealthy idolization. But Queen Victoria, she made sure she never missed an important anniversary. She never missed a birthday. She never missed a holiday. And she was doing a really good job by being queen, honoring the British people and what their accomplishments were. Things were going great. Well, this began to change with the death of King Albert, because King Albert passed away in 14 December 1861. Many people did not want to tell Queen Victoria that King Albert was dying because she idolized him so much. And Queen Victoria, she's very much of a sensitive person. So a lot of people didn't want to tell her, but deep down she knew what was happening. Then after King Albert died, she just went into a multi-year depression. This depression was so bad, many people were concerned about her mental health, if she's even mentally stable anymore. And she wasn't even doing any of her duties as queen. Everything was falling by the wayside. So just for years, they really didn't have monarchy anymore because King Albert passed away, and Queen Victoria, she was in such a bad depression, she couldn't do anything. And just really even just getting out of bed for her was an enormous problem. So even though they were going to the height of their power, the public really began to lose faith in Queen Victoria. Just after year after year after year, she wasn't fulfilling her duties as a queen. This began to change. In a carriage ride, when the carriage broke, she fell down, and she was nearly killed in the carriage ride. And she wrote in her diary, this is when she began to snap out of it, because she had to make the choice. Do I just fall and die, or do I stand up and live? And she said that's when she began to make the decision that she was going to stand up and live rather than just dying. So this is what began to snap her out of it when she had her near-death experience. The other thing that began to snap her out of it was a man named John Brown, because he really began to help her out during this time. And John Brown, he was very much of a drunkard, and he was a very vulgar person. And Queen Victoria and John Brown, they spent so much time together. Many people were wondering if Queen Victoria found a new lover. And Queen Victoria was just so idolized with John Brown that Victoria ordered that statues be built to honor John Brown. And then, as I said, people were wondering exactly what the nature of this relationship was. And even though Queen Victoria idolized John Brown, nobody else did. Because after Queen Victoria passed away, the royal family, or my children, grandchildren, they hated John Brown so much, they destroyed any trace to get the hands on of him. So so historians can't ever find out exactly what the nature of the relationship was, but because, as I said, the royal family destroyed all traces of him. But if you go to Great Britain, you'll find still a few statues honored to John Brown that Queen Victoria ordered to be constructed. But John Brown really helped her get out of this multi-year depression. So Queen Victoria began to reawaken here because Russia, they invaded the Ottoman Empire in 1871. But Queen Victoria, she's more focused on helping her people. So they passed like the Reform Bill. She began working closely with the Prime Minister again, because as I said, she really wasn't doing anything for years, but she began to bring her duties back. Then they began replacing the slums with new houses, and they're putting measures to encourage saving, really lifting up the standard of living for the British people. And they also began passing reforms like the Factory Act in 1871, which ensured that no child under the age of 10 would be allowed to work. And then children between the ages of 10 to 14 could only work a half day, and women could work no more than 56-hour weeks. They weren't quite at the 40-hour work weeks that we're at now, but they began moving forward, and it was really Queen Victoria and Great Britain who got a lot of this movement going forward. And so, other things she did, the Second Married Women's Property Rights Act. The first was in the year 1870, but this is only a minor victory for women because they could stand for elections and school boards. But with this next one, women could rent, inherit, and own property. And then women could represent themselves in court, and they began winning more rights to their children in divorce. So Queen Victoria, she's really bringing up a standard for living and really starting to bring like equality for like men and women and minorities into place. So things are still looking up. Then John Brown passes away. So as I said, John Brown really helped Queen Victoria get out of this depression. He passed away in March 1883. And again, Queen Victoria began to go into depression again after John Brown passed away. She began ordering commission ties built, busts, monuments, and statues of John Brown. And she ultimately wanted to do, she wanted to publish a private memoir for publication to honor John Brown, because she was fearful that many people would think that John Brown was just a servant, but he was much more than that. And those were Queen Victoria's words. I mean, the book was never published because her advisors said not to do it. But then this always comes into question, what kind of a relationship with this? Because it was very scandalous at the time in Great Britain. Now, if you want my personal opinion, I think it was platonic, because Queen Victoria, she had a very rough relationship with her mother. And so what she did, she naturally latched on to people like that. And that just fed John Brown's ego, which she's probably satisfied with. But I think it was platonic, but feel free to disagree with me on that. That's just my unprofessional opinion. And so then we come over to kind of more of the Ireland, because as I said, in 1848, the Irish had their massive potato famine, and millions of Irish were either forced to leave the country or they starved to death. Prime Minister Gladstone, what he wanted to do is he wanted to pacify Ireland and then give them independence. Queen Victoria absolutely hated this idea. She's like, if we give the Irish independence, we are going to start losing our empire and it's going to start breaking up. So Prime Minister Gladstone and Queen Victoria really started to dislike each other in regards for how to deal with Ireland. In 1870, Gladstone passed a law stating evicted tenants would be compensated, which Queen Victoria did not like regarding Ireland. And then in 1881, he introduced the Second Irish Land Act, allowing evicted tenants to apply for fair rent, tenure, or freedom from their lease. And he also supported home rule for Ireland, which Victoria hated. So really the issue of Ireland is really starting to dislike it's really starting to drive a wedge between Queen Victoria and Gladstone. And these two actually disliked each other so much. When Gladstone was elected, Victoria said, how can democracy work if people vote for people like Gladstone? And she just couldn't understand how anybody could like Gladstone and vote for him. So that's how much those two really just started to dislike each other. And then the final falling out between Queen Victoria and Gladstone, because the British had military in Sudan. The British general, Charles George Gordon, went to Sudan for a war. General Gordon refused to withdraw, and Queen Victoria wanted to get him reinforcements. But Gladstone, in his wisdom, decided to delay the reinforcements, and General Gordon was killed by the Sudanese. Well, the Queen Victoria was just furious after this point because one of the British generals and the British soldiers were just killed. So she hated Gladstone after this. So as much as she idolized King Albert, that's how much she hated Prime Minister Gladstone after this. And she never forgave Gladstone, because even after Gladstone passed away, Queen Victoria did not mourn him, and she wasn't even sad. That's how much those two did not like each other by this point. And then we get kind of into the next scandal with Queen Victoria here, because this is where an Indian servant, because India was controlled by the British. There was an Indian Muslim who went by the name of Abdul Karim, who began to take the place of John Brown as one of the Queen's clerks. And Queen Victoria was very fond of him. And so you have him, an Indian and a Muslim working really close to the Queen in Great Britain. This starts to become very scandalous, kind of like how John Brown was. And this is only 5 years after John Brown passed away. So you got another scandal here. And here's a quote here. This is from the book, Victoria the Queen. Julia Baird, she wrote this book, and this is my primary source for Queen Victoria. The author said, the case of Abdul Karim highlights her loyalty, her abhorrence to racism, and her kindness, as well as susceptibility to charm and her blinding need for intimacy. So again, you start to have like the scandals like John Brown, the scandals of Abdul Karim, where she's very fond of these people. But again, as the Queen, she shouldn't be doing that to people, especially after King Albert passed away. So yeah, she was very abhorrent to like racism, very kind, but she was also very susceptible to people who were charming. As the author said, she also had a blinding need for intimacy. And then Queen Victoria, she passed away. Because even though after King Albert passed away, she was constantly saying that she just wants to die. When she passed away, she did not want to. She wanted to keep being queen and keep ruling the United Kingdom. And she was actively involved in her duties as queen right up to the day she passed away. And then she passed away on 22 January 1901. And at the time, because she was queen for 60 years. And she was the longest serving British monarch until 2007, when the current Queen of England took the record. But until the current Queen of England, Victoria held the record for the longest monarch in British history. And she did many great things, and she also had many great faults as a person, which is where we come to Baha'u'llah's later. So what did Baha'u'llah say about Queen Victoria? He said, we make mention of thee for the sake of God, and the desire that thy name may be exalted through the remembrance of God, the creator of heaven and earth. He verily is witness unto that which I say. We have been informed that thou hast forbidden the trading in slaves, both men and women. This verily say is what God hath enjoined in this wondrous revelation. God hath truly destined a reward for thee. Because of this, he verily will pay the doer of my good his due recompense. Wert thou to follow what hath been sent unto thee by him, who is the all-knowing, the all-informed. So, notice with France, he condemns Napoleon III for what happened. Germany, he warns them. Great Britain, he says, no, what you are doing is righteous in the size of God, in the eyes of God. You ban slavery for both men and women. This is what we want. And Baha'u'llah continued. We have also heard that thou hast entrusted the reins of counsel into the hands of the representatives of the people. Thou indeed hast done well, for thereby the foundations of the edifice of thine affairs will be strengthened, and the hearts of all that are beneath thy shadow, whether high or low, will be tranquilized. It behooveth them, however, to be trustworthy among his servants, and to regard themselves as the representatives of all that dwell on earth. This is what counsels them in this tablet. He who is the ruler, the all-wise, blessed is he that entereth the assembly for the sake of God, and judgeth between men with pure justice. He indeed is the blissful. So what he's saying right here is, you began to push democracy, because in Great Britain, like women began to get the right to vote. The House of Commons really strengthened itself, and they really began taking care of the people. Well, it says this is what world leaders should be doing, exactly what Queen Victoria was doing. So, yes, Queen Victoria had many faults as a person, but Baha'u'llah didn't sit there and just start condemning her for everything that she did wrong. He also praised her for much of what she did right. Because again, like women's rights, rights of minorities, the standard of living for the British, that all went up under Queen Victoria, and this is what Baha'u'llah praises Queen Victoria for doing. As I said, Queen Victoria, she was the only world leader who read Baha'u'llah's letter and then responded. And Queen Victoria said, if this is of God, it will endure. If not, it can do no harm. So she read the letter where Baha'u'llah praised Queen Victoria in the British Empire. And she said, yeah, if he is of God, this is great news. If not, then it's not going to do anything to us. And even Abdul-Baha, if you remember, he's the Paul equivalent. He eventually received the British knighthood for feeding the hungry in the Holy Land in World War I. And Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Queen Marie of Romania, accepted the Baha'i faith, becoming the first world leader to become a Baha'i. And so, the third beast. Let's come back to what the Bible says. After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads and was given authority to rule. The reason why it was given authority to rule is we see the sun never set on the British Empire. It stretched around the world. So because of the good that Queen Victoria did, God let the British Empire set up their global empire. And Queen Victoria, she reigned for 60 years. That's why this third beast was given authority to rule. And with that, this is what we've gone over the last 4 sessions. And next session is going to be 20 November. So we'll stop here for any questions.
Hi. So I'm British, so I'm in shock here because I had to put on a blanket because I'm in complete shock that Britain was one of these beasts. And I didn't see anything about the Ancient of Days, so I don't see how you get that that Britain is one of the beasts if there's no Ancient of Days mentioned.
Yeah, it was there. Let me do a screen share. I can show it real quick.
It's too small. Can't see it.
Back up.
I also don't understand the leopard thing.
Okay, lay aside thy desire and set then thy heart towards thy Lord, the Ancient of Days. Because he says it right here in the letter. This is the opening of the letter to Queen Victoria.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
And the leopard, because the British had a couple symbols for their nation. One was a lion. Those are the wings of the eagle we saw coming out of Germany. The French often referred to the England as the leopard. That's where the leopard comes in. It's a reference the French make to the British.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm still in shock.
Steve, if
Yep.
there's one thing I might add, in the King James Version of the Bible, if you search the entire Bible, you will find no reference to the word animal. That's because in those days, if they wanted to say animal, they used the term beast.
Mhm.
So beast in the modern context tends to be something that seems to be something terrible, always has a bad connotation. But if you understand that they're simply using the term as animal, you understand it can be good and it can be bad. And certainly even in the book of Revelation, the throne is surrounded by 4 good beasts. So I think we have to be careful when we use the term beast, not to assume that it necessarily means something bad. It's just part of the way that things were translated into English at the time that the King James Version was written.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. Because remember the 4 beasts. First one was for Napoleon III. Behold, condemned what he was doing, starting those wars for no reason. Germany, he gave them a warning. Yes, you are great right now, but if you continue down this path, you are going to be overthrown like Napoleon III, which ended up happening. He said good things about Queen Victoria. So we saw kind of a condemnation, a warning, and something good for each one of the beasts. And then the 4th beast, that there is no 4th letter stating the Ancient of Days, because that was the Umayyad Caliphate from last week, and they were already overthrown by the time Baha'u'llah came. And so that's why there's no 4th letter with the Ancient of Days in there. And that was from our presentation last week.
So I wanted to ask, what stage of the Queen's reign was she in when she received the letters from Baha'u'llah? I guess this was after Albert had passed.
Correct.
And was it while she was still in her period of mourning?
I would have to pull the exact year for when the letter was written, because I do not know off the top of my head. I'll look it up and I'll shoot you an email.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We stop the recording and we can ask. I'll stick around if anybody else has any questions I'd like to ask off the recording, but oh, Marisa, your hands up.
Yes, I would like to ask about Armageddon.
Yes.
So how do you tie this up with all of the things that you have presented today?
Because Armageddon was World War I and World War II. Because World War I, that's when 20 million people were killed. World War II, that's when 72 million people were killed. And so Abdu'l-Baha said, 2 years before World War I started, we stand on the eve of the Battle of Armageddon. So, and that was part of the letter to Germany. So it really ties in under part 2. And actually, a little bit of history. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the one who took Germany in World War I, that was Queen Victoria's grandson, because Victoria's daughter married King Fritz from Germany. And so it was Queen Victoria's grandson that took the countries into World War I. And so then the Queen of Russia during World War I, that was Queen Victoria's daughter. So it was a lot of Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren fighting each other in World War I.
There's a hill in Israel
Mhm.
called Har Megiddo.
Mhm.
And there's, like prophecies regarding that place.
Mhm.
Do you recall the battle?
Yeah, because that's when the British Army, when they World War I, they came up over Egypt and they began advancing north and they took the Holy Land over. Which in the aftermath of World War I, the Holy Land was became the British Mandate because they won it from the Ottomans in the war. So World War Armageddon isn't just one battle; it's World War I and World War II, because that's what Baha'u'llah said was coming to Germany in his letter to them. And that's what Abdu'l-Baha said in 1912, 2 years before Armageddon took place.
And sorry.
No, go ahead, Marisa.
And that's also the time when the British Empire defeated the Ottoman Empire and prevented the hanging of Abdu'l-Baha. I think they were trying to, punish Abdu'l-Baha at that time.
I would have to look that up, but what was going on with Abdu'l-Baha during that time, because I don't know exactly, but if someone else has the answer, feel free to chime in.
No, that is correct, Marisa, that it was the intention of the Sultan to hang Abdu'l-Baha, or to kill Abdu'l-Baha, and General Allenby swept through so quickly that they had to flee Haifa before they had a chance to do so. But the British had been made aware by the British Baha'is, the British government was aware of this intention to kill Abdu'l-Baha, and hence they had notified the troops that one of their priority places to protect when they got into Haifa was to protect Abdu'l-Baha.
Thank you for that information, Jay.
Mm-hmm.
And Steven, excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
I might offer a little side note on Armageddon. The reason that it was considered, it was synonymous with battle in the time of the Jews, and the reason for that has to do with geography, because there's a north-south trade route going along the Mediterranean coast, and then there's another major north-south trade route that comes up through the Jordan Valley. And in both cases, to get from one trade route to the other is very difficult in those days before you had roads and motor vehicles. There's these hills, you're coming up from actually below sea level when you're in the Jordan Valley. It's almost always difficult to get from the one trade route to the other, except there's one geological exception where the land is relatively flat from the Bay of Haifa going across to the Jordan Valley. Okay, and this is the Jezreel Valley, and it became a major trade route between the two north-south trade routes. There was this one east-west trade route, the only place along those entire routes where it was easy to transfer from the Jordan Valley trade route to the Eastern Mediterranean trade route. And thus, if you could control the Jezreel Valley, you could control both trade routes. So it was extremely lucrative, extremely important to be able to control that point. And because it was so important to control that point, there were lots of armies in the past that fought over it. And it became synonymous with battle. Like you might say, you know, today, if you say it was his Waterloo, most people understand that, you know, this is the final battle that Napoleon died at, so, or was defeated at. So in those times, you would say it was Armageddon or Megiddo would be synonymous with saying place of battle.
Thank you.
So do you want to stop the recording? If anybody else has any questions, you can ask off recording.